Marilyn was born in Gawler and spent the first 20 years of her life living here in Williston. She married David Tucker and spent the next 34 years away from Gawler, having a career in accounting, living in many places, including 3 times in Canberra, Broken Hill, Mount Isa, Sydney, in various tents and caravans in the scrub, in the Northern Territory and elsewhere. She raised 2 children and a husband. The wheel turned full circle, and for the last 20 years, she has been living again in Gawler. Marilyn is an organiser and a fixer. In Canberra, she was in the Canberra Youth Orchestra Parents Group, organising tours, concerts and costumes for overseas competition. In Gawler, she joined the local National Trust Gawler branch and quickly became treasurer and consequently was elected to the State Council of the National Trust and spent 4 years as chairman of the Finance and Governance Committee, presiding during a critical time when there were essential and complex financial problems to solve. Marilyn has always sewn for the last 40 years, has been an avid quilter and art admirer. Quilting turned out to lead to key and lifelong social bonding activities. Interest in art led her to undertake a postgraduate course in arts history at the University of Adelaide. This led to an added interest in research, which is why she found the Timer Project a worthwhile opportunity to use those skills. Timer Fashions is not just a story about a business in Gawler that ran over several decades, but significantly contributed to the female workforce of the community. It provided an opportunity for women to work outside the home. Women newly arrived in Australia after the Second World War also were able to financially assist their families in establishing themselves after losing everything. It set new benchmarks for women's roles in the local society. It wasn't all just hard slog. They had fun too. Welcome, Marilyn.
Thank you, Margaret. Margaret and I have been friends for a long time through quilting. Now, to add some context to my talk on Timer Fashions, I'll give you an overview of the National Trust of South Australia and how it operates, because that is what led me into this research. The National Trust of South Australia was formed in the early 1950s with the initial purpose of putting pressure on the state government over residential development of the Hills Face Zone. To this day, that holds. However, with new legislation over heritage matters, who knows where that might go. The Trust expanded from natural heritage matters to include built heritage, some of it donated and some of it bequeathed. These days we are much more careful about what we accept, because often it comes with burdens we're not able to bear. Largely, the Trust has continued its work in protecting all heritage, and the fight goes on. I'll cite a recent example, that is the coach house on the corner of Cross Road and Fullerton Road, which recently the government has decided it will not knock down but move, which is going to be an interesting exercise in itself. That was pushed by a group, a consortium of like-minded people led largely by the National Trust. All national trusts throughout Australia are state-based and operate differently in each case, but they have a collective voice in Canberra with a jointly operated secretariat. But all of these state-based organisations suffer from the same problem, shortage of money. Unlike the National Trust of the United Kingdom, we are not the beneficiaries of large financial bequests or government support, or being the proprietor of large lotteries which lead to grand windfalls. Most Australian trusts have large asset portfolios and small cash reserves. This makes it very hard to fund restoration and maintenance. Many believe wrongly that we are a well-funded organisation, but the fact is that we are a small volunteer-run busy group with a very small dedicated paid staff running the state office. Our own state had developed a major financial problem about 10 years ago. At that time, I was elected to the State Council as Chairman of Finance and Governance. We addressed the financial problem by selling off stranded assets. These are properties that don't have branches to support them and often are in remote areas and are little used by the public. We sold off these assets and invested in shares and long-term investments to generate income which could be turned to covering the costs of being responsible for 129 properties. Incidentally, this is the largest number of properties of any national trust in the world, and they're here in South Australia. Some of these properties at the time were state government owned and leased to us, including our Gawler Museum building. About 3 years ago, after 20 years of lobbying the government, it transferred the properties, a group of the properties, to the National Trust of South Australia, so we now hold the titles, including our own Gawler Museum. This is good, but didn't change the financial situation because the government have never paid any of the costs of the upkeep of those properties that we were managing on their behalf. Many of the properties are managed by the 35 branches of the State National Trust, such as our own here in Gawler. Branches provide the operation of museums and upkeep of native reserves. In Gawler we run the museum at 59 Murray Street, and if you haven't visited it, you should. Our branch operates with a small number of active participants and volunteers. We keep the museum open 4 afternoons a week. We run school educational visits and special visits by interested groups. We do the maintenance. We apply for grant funds to undertake large repairs and build new displays. And as part of that, we do research into interesting matters related to Gawler's history, which of course is why we undertook to do research into the Timer story. Robbie?
Yes.
Oh, there he is. As background to the story, there's going to be a slideshow showing some photos taken within the Timer factory. At the end of my talk, we'll go through them more slowly, and those of you who recognise situations may like to make comment or speak about them. Some years ago, our branch recognised that while we had a number of stories of the early days of Gawler, there was little that we could add due to the passage of time. So we decided to investigate some more contemporary stories, that is, things that had happened in the living memory of some of our local residents. This gave us a primary resource to turn to gain information. 2 ideas that sprang to mind, one being the many stories to be found in our migrant hostel of the 1940s and 50s. This has been a most successful project, culminating in a written history from many of those who started their lives in Australia living in the hostel. Secondly, we embarked on the story of one of the largest businesses to operate in Gawler, Timer Fashions. During the 19th century, we had large foundries in Gawler which employed up to 1,500 men. But Timer was different. It employed primarily women with just a handful of men. It had its origins in a small business started by Joe Jacobs in the 1920s. He set his business up in the main street, Murray Street, where he employed untrained women to do simple machine sewing. They made nursery squares, or more commonly known as nappies, aprons and pyjamas. With training, the workers developed into making dresses and skirts. The business continued on during the hard times of the Depression. But with the start of the Second World War, manufacturers were required to make military uniforms. Joe, who was running the factory, however, was offered a chance to become an inspector of such establishments, and Timer went slowly from then on. Surprisingly, despite the war, the government, the federal government, implemented a decentralisation policy in 1942, and to encourage the textile industry to participate, offered licences to import fabric. Now, this is very puzzling to me, because when you think about it, this fabric was coming from overseas and therefore had to travel through oceans at war. I've not resolved exactly how that worked. I should go to Canberra one day and do some research into that. The Myer Emporium approached Joe to set up a clothing factory in Gawler with a view to an exclusive deal for children's clothes. Myer purchased the existing plant and Joe was appointed the manager. Again, the business was operated from the main street. It employed 20 machinists, growing to 60 within 3 years. Joe managed to combine both being the manager of the business and continuing as an inspector of other businesses. The business was very profitable, so together with the directors of Myer, Joe established a company called Gawler Manufacturing Company Limited. The business grew and consequently purchased the old Fotheringham's brewery, which many of you may know is where Steinborner's main premises is today. A new factory was built on the site, incorporating the then existing cellar. The cellar was later used as a plant room for the generation of steam and a standby generator for power. Power failures were frequent in that era. Some may say they're frequent now. The business flourished and garments were made to cover all ages under the Timer brand, such as day timer, school timer, sport timer. Because of the success of the company, it changed its name to Timer Fashions Limited. I haven't as yet discovered the origins of the name Timer. It's a most intriguing question. I asked Keith Jacobs about it, but he was unable to tell me. So I'm not sure. We might have to go back to Joe to find the answer to that one. The garments were sold all over Australia. Export orders were sought, but without success. More capital was needed, so a public company was floated on the Adelaide Stock Exchange in the early 1950s. This company was called Adelaide Holdings Limited. An extension was built onto the factory to hold the growing business, which employed about 300 people, using 500,000 yards of imported fabric a year, which represents about 250,000 garments. It was the biggest clothing manufacturer in Australia during the 1950s and 60s. Joe retired from the business early in the 1970s and his son Keith took a larger role. The business became less profitable with the increase in imported garments into Australia during the 1970s, resulting from the reductions in import tariffs. That's when we started to get very cheap garments coming in, primarily from Asia. A Sydney businessman took over the company on the stock exchange and wound up the clothing manufacturing activities to use the company as a vehicle for another business. The plant in Gawler was sold to a local employee of Timer, and he continued manufacturing in Gawler into the 1990s. He did contract work for designers like George Gross and Harry Hu. Lots of questions arose during our research, such as how were the garments designed? Who was the designer? It seems the business largely copied from garments seen in stores along Rundle Street or in magazines, or they were even being worn by passers-by. There is a report in the Advertiser of August 1959. It was what I would term a puff piece. We'd call it advertorial today. It was not an investigative report. It describes the design process carried out by Mrs. Green, the workroom manager, and 3 other women described in the article as designers, really those who created the patterns from which the garments were made. Very skilled work in its own right, but not created from imagination. They perused fashion magazines from Europe and the USA. Garments were bought and taken apart. including garments flown from the USA. From these sources, a new garment emerged and was made and refined before going into production. Jo was reported in this article to say that you have to be fast in fashion and no doubt very inventive. All garments were made to fill orders. They were not made on spec. So great effort was put into ensuring every garment was inspected before it left the factory. One of the employees we interviewed reported that if a garment didn't pass the test, it was thrown down a well in the grounds. Now, that's one person's story. They did not operate a seconds outlet. The production was to meet the needs of Myers primarily, but the garments were also sold through other outlets. They were largely simple items, made to a low price point. They were not aspirational or glamorous by, say, Prue Acton or Adele Weiss, designers of the 1960s. They were largely purchased by working girls for wearing to work and for weekends. Evening wear was also at the lower end of the market. Now, this is a thing that we all must follow up on. One of the big sellers was hot pants. Sadly, we don't have any to show you, but if you ever see any in an op shop, please let us know. Just check that they've got a timer label in them, and we'd love to add them to our collection. Attempts were made to move the garments up market during the 1970s, obviously to fill the gap in the production left by the cheap imports. To this end, more sophisticated garments were produced, and large advertisements were placed in magazines like Vogue Australia, using well-known and no doubt expensive models of the day. One such model, and we have a photograph of this, was Tanya Verstack, who some may remember was a Miss Australia. Another question that came to us was, who were the workers? Now, some of them are here today. They were largely local girls. Some even travelled from Kapunda and Udunda on the train each morning. Not possible to do that now, but in those days you could. After Elizabeth was established, many travelled from there each day. Train timetables were prepared with the needs of these workers in mind, because the business was seen by the government as important. Amongst the information we had was a lovely brochure that was to encourage women to join timers' workforce, and it had this lovely little phrase: choose a career that will be an asset to you through life. So they were all going to learn to sew and continue to sew. We've interviewed many of the employees. One of these interviews was given by Pauline Davids, and she, like the others, spoke of her working life, which began in her case when she was 14 years old in January 1954. Her starting salary was £3.17 and sixpence, and she started by removing the stray threads and fabric dags from the insides of the garments. She knew this was a humble task, but it was important to the money-back guarantee company policy. She advanced through the ranks, eventually becoming a charge hand, in essence the foreman of an operation. There were 6 such operations. The work was repetitive and boring, but everyone took pride in doing a good job. As people progressed through the business, they specialised in different aspects of the manufacture, like making collars or setting sleeves into garments at the amazing rate of 100 pairs per hour. I'm a sewer and I can't imagine how hard that would be. Another worker reported making dozens of cuffs for little boys' dress shirts, again a fiddly and tedious task. Physical attributes often determine the task, like a cutter who needed to be tall and strong to lean over the layout tables and manage the thick piles of fabric. This job was done mainly by the few males who worked there. They all worked one shift, from 8:30 a.m. to 4:45 p.m, 5 days a week, with occasional overtime in the evening and maybe a few hours on Saturday mornings at peak times at the beginning of a new season. Holiday leave was 3 weeks at Christmas. Pauline reported that she worked there until 1976 when the business closed. Another worker I interviewed, Eileen Holmes, joined in 1944. She was one of the first 14 staff members. Her salary was £3.15. You notice that Pauline got another 2 and 6pence when she joined a few years later. She had undertaken a dressmaking course at the local adult education centre, so she started with schools, which she developed, and quickly became a charge hand responsible for overseeing the work of others and their training. She told us of some of the difficulties in working through the agent system, which sold the garments more widely than to Myers. These were agents, you may recall, travelling salesmen, and these were people who moved around going to stores in, say, outback Queensland or New South Wales, offering Timer garments that they might sell in their local stores. Her particular, I suppose it was a bit of a gripe really, was a particular reference to a range of dresses that were made of a fabric known as tootle linen. It was a linen-like fabric, it wasn't actually linen. They were designed to have a matching trim of lace. She did the dyeing and knew of the problems, so requested only the successful matches would be sold. In other words, sometimes if she was trying to get hot pink, she wouldn't get hot pink, and so the colour wasn't quite right in her view. This message did not get through, and garments were ordered and sold in mismatched colours. Eileen also commented that she, like many others, didn't buy garments from Timer because they made their own clothes at home. If you could sew, yes. Waste was kept to a minimum. One way was explained to us by one of our National Trust members who as a child had access to the fabric scraps. They were stored in the garage of our member's aunt who lived next to the factory. As a treat, she was allowed to climb into the heap and fossick for larger pieces of fabric, which she might make into clothes. I don't know, Lorraine, if you've still got any of those clothes, have you?
No.
The stored scraps were destined to be made into mattress filling once they were shredded, so nothing went to waste. Accidents did happen, but very rarely. They were mainly needle injuries, although we had one accident told to us of a finger being thrown in a bin after an accident with an electric cutting knife. There was no microsurgery then. All accidents were attended to at the local hospital. One young girl caught her long blonde hair in a knife mechanism. This was simply solved. They cut off her hair, so she became have short blonde hair. Workers largely reported that it was a happy place to work, despite the fear of Mrs. Green. When her clicking heels were heard approaching down the floor, all heads were bent down working. There was no reports of industrial action, although that was not common in a largely female workforce, with only about 6 men working there during the peak times. With the closing of the factory, the workers moved on to other jobs. Some of the more experienced, like Eileen, continued with Colin Thiel, who had purchased the plant. Thanks to members of our branch for their help in assembling this talk and gathering the garments, some of which have even made their way from Western Australia into our collection. We have some on display and we store others in purpose-designed containers. As you see here, I'm joined by my friends Gwen and Ethel, who are wearing garments of the 1960s. This one in beautiful crinoline. Do you remember crinoline? Now, I must make some acknowledgements. First of all, I was given verbal information and written information by Keith Jacobs. I haven't seen Keith walking in the street lately. I don't think he does that anymore. Verbal information came from Colin Thiel, who was the chief cutter and purchased the plant in the late 1970s. Verbal information from numerous employees, especially Pauline Davids and Eileen Holmes, was used here. There were articles in the newspapers, including the Advertiser. There was a staff newsletter published by Myer, which we had some copies of, and it had information about life at Timer. There was also publicity shots we have in our collection of Timer fashions in magazines such as I mentioned before, like Vogue Australia. And importantly, I must mention that the foundations of this research were started by Mike and Joan Dennison, who undertook the initial oral history gathering from women who had worked at Timer. Now I think we'll go through the slides, Robbie, on a slower pace, and we'll perhaps talk about what we see. That's obviously an advertisement. So that's the photograph taken from Julian Terrace, the back. And that, now think what that reminds you of in this day and age. That reminds me of a shot that you might see in a Sri Lankan or Pakistani garment factory. But that was in Gawler. And look how diligent they're tending. Mrs. Green must be in the offing, I think. She can't be far away. There we are with the stacks of fabric. Multiple layers were cut at a time.
Is that Doug Barker?
Who is it?
Doug Barker.
Doug Barker. Right. And they used to lay the patterns out for seeking the most economical use of the fabric, of course. Although sometimes you do need to go with the weave of the fabric, so they would try to minimalise that sort of problem by designing garments that didn't need to waste lots of fabric by cutting on the bias. And here they are laying out the fabric. And look over on the far wall at the finished garments hanging up. And you can see the knife mechanisms that they used to cut with. There's one at work.
Just the thickness of the fabric on the right there.
Yes, that's right. I don't know how many layers, that would be a lot, yes. Very thick layering of the fabric on the right-hand side, where there's a female cutter, which was unusual, I understand. One of the main problems when you're matching patterns, they're working on there. Here they are, pinning patterns to fabric. Notice how smartly they're dressed. Stockings, high heels and tight skirts. I don't know if that woman on the right may be the infamous Mrs. Green. See how thick the fabric is? If you look here, looks like it's cut out of a piece of timber. That looks to me like a design for hot pants.
Yep. That's your hot pants costing.
Yes, there's a costing of hot pants here. How much it costs to make one? These are some garments that we have in our collection at the museum. When you hold clothes in a museum, there are requirements on how long you can display them for, and when we store them, we have to just store them in purpose-provided boxes in acid-free paper. In some circumstances, they're only on display for about 5 or 6 months at a time. We in Gawler are a little slack on that one. This is a visit by a school to the factory. They may have received that little brochure where you could a lifelong activity could be your purpose. They were probably being encouraged to join Time of Factory. Now, some of you may recognise some of these faces.
Yvonne Riggs on the left-hand side.
Right.
Yvonne Riggs.
Those heaps are part finished garments that are moving on to the next person. And here's where the steam comes in.
Steam buster.
That looks like children's clothes to me.
Steam presses. Holy moly.
How many would have worked in that factory?
200.
300 people worked there. That number, I think, is the highest point. How they kept track of things amazes me when you look at that.
That 300 would be on a par with Levi's when they were going.
This was a showroom that they had attached to the factory where buyers could come and look at the garments. I understand there were a few girls who sometimes modelled for when they had visiting potential buyers.
I remember that room. It was magnificent.
Who are they?
I don't know who they are, but whether they're local people or whether they are models, because we do have some. There's Tanya Verstack, when she was, probably after she was Miss Australia, because she wouldn't have done this while she was Miss Australia. Those are some of our garments in our collection. One of them, this snappy number here, is here tonight. The blue garment on the right was found by Jill Richter's daughter in Perth, and she returned it to us.
That's the lot there, Marilyn.
Okay, thank
If I can
you.
find the arrow to exit, I'd go on to that other.
Oh yes, we've got some other shots which some of you who worked at Timer may find interesting. A few years ago we at the museum held a reunion for people who'd worked in the factory with the view that we might gain some information from them to add to our story. However, that proved to not be very successful. They confirmed what I told them, but I gained very little additional information. They had a lovely time meeting their friends and eating a sumptuous morning tea. However, I didn't gain much information. Here we are. You can see the museum is bursting.
It's Yvonne Chamberlain or Yvonne Berryman there.
Yes, it is, yes. There's someone.
Yeah, can I just say something?
Yes, you may.
You were referring to how many layers of material
Yes.
cutting out. I actually cut out the highest layer that ever got cut out. That was 485.
Layers of fabric.
485 layers of fabric. The cutting knife was a 7-inch knife, and it was right to the top. It only had about a quarter of an inch to move to cut out those...
Must have been a very sharp knife, is all I could see.
Yes, yes. Also,
Don't know whether we're getting this.
you haven't mentioned, we used to produce all the uniforms for the colleges in Victoria. We had all the fabrics there, and they all had their own pattern of the fabrics for their uniforms, and we used to make all the uniforms for all the interstate colleges, plus two in Adelaide, I think it was. And we used to make all the white shirts for all the schools, and they get sold through Myers and John Martin's and places like that. Also, referring to the girl that got her hair caught up in the machine, it got caught up with that straight knife, which had a revolving sort of knob on the back of the machine. You put your head over and you'd like this cutting, and she had the long hair. Her name was Kay Chamberlain at the time, and and I had to cut the hair off.
Oh, hairdresser as well.
to get her free from the machine.
Yeah.
Also, referring to the finger in the bin that got cut off, I actually picked up 3 fingers, 2 from one girl and 1 from the other one. The one was the one I put in the bin. But I could tell you lots of stories.
These days, well, perhaps you should write these stories down. We can always do with more information.
I think I've got most of them.
Yeah, right.
Well, actually, as far as I know, when I was in charge, there was 275 girls. So, I don't know. Another story, I mean, when I started there, they still had the factory up the top of the street, and old Joe, he'd say, right, we've got to take a load of work up to the top factory, like these nursery screens. And I was only a lad then, 16, and I'd have to put them in the back of the van, and he'd drive it up the street, about 2 miles an hour, and then I'd unload it. Well, we're going up the bit of a rise there, and the back doors happened to come open of the van, and all the work that was packed in the back of the van all rolled out in the middle of the street.
Paved the street, did you?
Joe says, don't all stop, just put it back in the van. And quite often, Joe used to come to me and say, hey, you're not very busy today here. What about going up to my place and do my garden, cut the hedge and trim up all the shrubs? And he'd say, I'll tell them that you went home sick.
I think Joe was fairly canny.
Joe would do that quite often. And he would also sit on the machines in the middle of the factory, fast asleep. He'd be there, head down, fast asleep. You know, it was amazing, some of the things. And going back to Big Jacob, I remember one night we had a dinner. I was in the cutting section, and we would go out for dinner down to our hotel. And this night sort of played up a bit, and next day turned up at work, and he said, I'm not feeling too good. And I said, no, I'm not either. He said, let's say we go over in the old house. There used to be an old hotel, wooden hotel on the corner. That's been all pushed over now. And we went across there in the morning, and we slept until dinner time in this old house.
I also heard stories that we recorded from the girls that when they went out for Christmas lunches, sometimes they would be a little worse for wear when they returned. And they were supposed to continue working on for a few more hours before knock-off time, and they'd climb onto the heaps of fabric and have a snooze instead.
And also, when we used to break up on Christmas, before Christmas and holidays, we'd rush across to the South End Hotel and have drinks and so forth. And the girls used to come back and say there's 3 girls or 2 girls over there laying on the floor. They've had a bit too much. And I'd have to go then and carry them back to the factory.
And put them on top of the fabric.
Just a few of the little bits that used to go on.
Yeah.
Also, you said 8:30 to 4:45. It's 8:15 to 4:45.
Was it?
Fridays we used to knock off at 3:30.
Oh, right, well, obviously my source didn't know the full details. Okay, thanks, Colin. Anyone got any questions?
Comment. We've got a living model here.
Oh, yes, we do have a living
Just
model.
Stand up, Tilly.
Jill is wearing one of the garments from our collection, and it looks quite smart, don't you?
Over here.
She's even found some gloves to match from her own collection.
Very good, Jill.
It looks very smart. It looks like the jacket certainly looks like it was made for you.
It does have a skirt.
So you can have trousers or a skirt.
It was the skirt was of the same material, but it was too big for me. I meant to bring it, but then I forgot. So,
But it must have been one of the very earliest pantsuits, I would say. It's probably in 1970s, early 70s, I suspect.
it's the only one we've got, isn't it?
Yes.
All the rest are dresses. And
Most of the garments we have are summer dresses, apart from that crimpoline, which of course was like being in a plastic bag.
and the hitchhiker pants, very wide, very wide. So yeah, and we do have one little timer dress, don't we? Little
A child's dress.
Yes.
And Margaret provided me with some photographs of a family of children who obviously were dressed regularly by timer. And I meant to bring them tonight to show you, but I've left them on the dining room table, so I don't have them with me. But they were children's clothes that were manufactured. Okay, thank you very much. Usually it's me telling him.
Okay.
Right. Well, Marilyn, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for a very interesting and informative talk. I know we didn't arrive in Australia till the very early 70s, but when we walked through the door, my husband said, "You had a dress like that," which I did, except it was about
That much shorter. You probably cut it off.
No, it was made like that, I think, you know,
Yes.
the Dream Soon era and stuff.
Yeah.
And I loved when you mentioned the crimpling.
It's ghastly fabric,
It
but
was terrible. And when it first came out, Mum and I first, oh, this is wonderful. But by the time you'd been to the local dance on a Saturday night, and every young man, including Phil probably later on, unhooked their watch from the back of the crimpling, you looked like a wire brush by the time you walked out. It was dreadful.
Awful
Every
fabric.
touch just pulled it. It was awful. But of course you didn't have to iron it, so we
No.
thought it was wonderful.
we thought we'd just fling it in the wash.
Yeah.
I foolishly made myself a tennis dress from it, and I used to hate it if I had to play tennis on a hot day because
Oh, it stuck.
it was like playing in a plastic bag.
It was awful. And then something a little bit more poignant for me, I didn't know of Time of Fashions. I'd seen it in the museum, which was wonderful, I enjoyed. My mum was a milliner and a dressmaker, but when I was a girl at school in the 50s, she got a job in a sewing factory because she could work part-time, and that was enough for Mum. And remember, she was a milliner and a dressmaker, but she started off as a cottoner. Now, when you said about cutting
The dags off.
all the day, that's what Mum started, because she said, well, I can't believe this, I'm a cottoner, but I'm sure I'll move up, which she did later.
Well, that seems to be the place everybody started.
Yes, that was it. But for Mum, you know, it really was. But it was her part-time job, and that money was hers, so she loved it. So, Marilyn, it's brought back a lot of memories for
Oh,
me,
good,
thank
good.
you, and it was really lovely. So, we'd like, yeah, I haven't forgotten Brian.
He's always trying to tell people what to do.
You can't tell school teachers what to do,
Oh,
Brian,
okay.
and you should have learned that one. Oh, and Jill's suit, if I can just say one more. As a young teacher in the 60s, middle 60s, we weren't allowed by the headmaster to wear trousers.
No.
But when the pantsuit came out, there was a couple of young teachers there, we went and spoke to him. So as long as the jacket and the trousers matched,
It was
we
okay.
could wear it. So, Jill, it was lovely to see that. I had one very similar to that too, and it was really nice. And the kids thought we were great. So
You're very up to date.
So Marilyn, very grateful. Thanks from the Gawler history team and all the people here tonight. We'd like to present you with that.
Oh,
And
thank
thank
you.
you again for a lovely, lovely talk.